Soulless Dead, Chapter 15, The Exodus. As the plane began to take off, it began picking up leaves and small dust particles and blowing them everywhere. I limped slowly away from the plane as he looked out the window. I could see him mouthing, "Don't do this," and I told him to keep going. I grabbed the duffel bag and my vest and I secured it on myself much more tighter. I took the duffel bag and slung it over my shoulder. I briefly winced as the weight had shifted over to my leg, the one with the wound. I grabbed some antiseptic and I grabbed a little tiny bottle of alcohol that they placed in there and poured it on there and rebandaged myself a little better. In my haste, I began to look around and I saw that many of the dead had begun to cock their head towards me. With a ravenous growl, they began to walk, limping, or simply shuffling towards me. I pulled out my kukri knife that had been with me since day one. One of them came close and I tossed it. It hit him just below the throat and knocked him to the ground. The knife buried just enough to where he couldn't immediately get back up, and I went over, pulled the knife out, and put it through his eye. A large juicy noise had made because a lot of the dead bodies had been in the heat so long that the bacteria behind the eye had begun to swell so much. It popped everywhere, sprayed. Luckily, I didn't get any on me. I sheathed my knife and knew that I couldn't just stand here and fight. I started to walk my way through the park as quiet as I possibly could. I began to walk towards where I saw some shells, some brass casings that had been left by the artillery gun that was parked there not a few hours ago. I could hear some small explosions, fuel lines possibly, or barrels, and the thick, dense smell of burning wood and metal. I started to walk towards it. I'd slowly made my way to a small chain-link fence that had created a barrier between the park and that small industrial complex where the war hogs were staying. I looked around briefly and saw no one there. Tire tracks, tank treads, and all sorts of brass casings were on the ground. Dead bodies were strewn everywhere. I crawled underneath the fence and made my way in there, flipping bodies over looking for something useful. A couple of them had booze bottles, a few of them had matches, and even cigarettes. Nothing I could really use, other than the matches. I made my way into the complex, and I looked at the war-torn, bullet-riddled building that was once their home. There were the 8 bodies just laying there, in large pools. The dead had made their way into the complex and were just meandering around. Some were eating on the dead men that I had personally killed, and others were just looking around into the ceiling, into nothingness. Their blindness was definitely something that I could take advantage of. I remember that I had a small airsoft grenade that I used that was powered by CO2. I pulled the pin and tossed it to the adjacent side of the room. It went off with a large bang, and the other ones began to follow towards the sound. As they walked away, I followed closely behind them and wandered right past them. There were close to 50, and I was definitely scared and treading lightly. I had the 2 pistols that I had stolen. One was holstered and the other one was in a backpack. I had plenty of magazines for my other handguns, and my revolver was still there, but I preferred to use the magazines for now. I made my way to the other side, the rear entrance. Again, bullet holes were riddled everywhere and blood was splattered all over the place. Only this time the men were a little more thorough. They had been stacked. I looked out over yonder and I saw a bunch of trucks driving by, and I wasn't sure whether they were mine or theirs, but at this point, all trucks were enemies. I made my way slowly into the industrial complex. I went back down to the staircase just behind everybody, where we were, down to where I lost it. Despite my better judgment, I went back down there and gently shut the door behind me and placed a small rope on the door with paracord. Knowing that if I didn't make too many noises, it wouldn't be a big deal. And the door was shut already, so that meant that there weren't any dead, and if there were, there wouldn't be many. I slowly walked my way down the hallway, and I could hear the sound of broken glass and dirt grind underneath my boot. Each door was open, and each door was empty as all get out. Beds were overturned, things were emptied out, and you could see some papers, maybe some empty food wrappers laying on the ground, as if everyone was leaving in a hurry. At least my people got them out. The smell was still really bad, and it was still evident, as it was before. I grabbed a shemagh out of my rear dump pouch, and I placed it over my mouth because the smell had gotten really bad to where I could taste it on the back of my tongue and on the back of the palate of my nose. I continued to walk with the flashlight under my pistol and briefly shining it on certain spots just to be sure that there weren't any dead. The 2 dead guards that were laying there before were stacked next to each other on one side of the wall. They were beginning to stink as well, but luckily there was a bullet casing in each head, 1 shell for each head, so that meant that they wouldn't have to get back up. And then I made it back to that long hallway with that door, which was briefly opened. I don't know what was in me, what was telling me and beckoning me to go to that room again. I don't know. To see if there was good in people, to see if their bodies were moved. I don't know what it was, but it made me want to go there and see. To affirm that there were still good in people. That there were things that we could have faith in. That there were virtues in the eyes of men and women. I slowly made my way. The apprehension, the flashbacks began to bombard my mind. I put my hand on my head and I braced myself against a wall, breathing heavily and sweating even harder than before. It wasn't the pain in the leg that made me do so, it was the memories. The mental pain, the blockage. It was like a flood of pure disgust coming over me. It made me want to upchuck, but I knew I couldn't. I collected myself and made my way back down the hallway. I continued on. I waited at the door for what felt like minutes, putting my hand against the door, wanting to push it open, but there was a part of me telling me not to do it. You weren't going to like what you were going to see. You didn't need to see that again. All it would do was create worse memories, but I needed some form of closure. I put my hand, and it was shaking, and I was scared, but I needed to know. I placed my hand on the door and pushed it open the rest of the way. It creaked as the rusted bolts on the side of the door had jarred, and it finally rested against the other wall. The beds were empty. The handcuffs had been cut with bolt cutters. There was a note on the wall, wrote in chalk. It said this: "To all those who survive, leave this place and come to these coordinates." And there was the coordinates of the town. I wasn't exactly good with directions, but I knew that much, just by the debriefings we had been doing as of late. There was also a radio frequency for the radio that we had used in our little village that we had started, and even some supplies. I didn't dare take the supplies because I knew if someone else in greater need than me came, they would definitely need it more than I would, especially in a hellish, stinky hole like this. I sat on one of the wire frames for a moment, looking at my leg and rubbing the shoulder that had been briefly cracked. All these wounds and all these things put me on a journey that I wasn't sure that I could finish. I wasn't exactly fighting the good fight. I took the duffel bag off my back, and I placed it on the ground. I rummaged through it and found Cliff Bars, some cans of soda, a couple bottles of water, some isopropyl, and some other things like that, some painkillers, some stomach aid, and some Pepto, and even some powder to clean water. All very useful things, but things I really didn't care for at the moment. I found flares and smoke bombs, some magazines, and some ammo. Things that would make a normal survivalist jump with joy and grin with glee. Green with envy, as a matter of fact. But again, I began rummaging. A t-shirt, some pants, some socks, and other things like that, and even a rolled-up pair of deployable shoes. All things that would be great. I reached down and I felt a small metal tin. I pulled it out and it had an Air Force symbol on it, and I opened it up. I pulled the rubber band that was keeping it closed and pulled the tin's lid off slowly. I expected to find a first aid kit, or maybe some cigarettes, or maybe some candy. Who knows? Just a stash, but what I found was a little more meaningful. It had been something that I hadn't touched since the many months that this started. It was a Bible. It was well worn on all the sides. The leather on it was cracked, which meant it was well worn, well used. There were a couple bookmarks and some folded pages, some notes on the side, and even a couple letters that the person had wrote to himself. Of all the things that were in this bag that could have brought me a great deal of joy for survival, being out by myself, this was the thing that brought a tear to my eye. I sat there holding the Bible. The duffel bag gently slumped to the ground as I let go of the bag. I placed both hands of it and opened it. It opened to Exodus, and I began to read about all the brave stories of the mighty Jews as they left Egypt. All that they knew, all the faith that they had, though they were slaves, many of them would whine about being stuck out in the desert with some guy who apparently didn't know where he was going. They would complain and whine, and the guy just dealt with it, even though if it were me, I probably would have lashed out a couple times. But he had faith that God would see him through it. They would mess up and God would punish them, and they would wonder why they were being punished even though they knew. They saw all these miracles for themselves, and yet they still made mistakes. I looked around the room and reminisced as I saw the ghosts of the two children, an outline, the memory of them laying where we'd found them. They weren't there, but they were there in my mind. I ignored it and continued to read on. The daylight began to lower, and I'd known I'd been there for hours reading because the sun had begun to go down, and the beam of light that was coming through the barred windows had begun to fade. I lit a small survival candle that was in the bag and continued to read on how, though they were going through great and horrible things, they had faith and they were able to get through it. Even their leader messed up, and he was still forgiven. I wouldn't really call myself much of a leader because of the stupid things I've allowed myself to do, but it definitely put it in perspective for me. I closed the book, gently placed it back in the tin, and folded the rubber band that was holding it on shut and placed it in the bag gently, but this time at the top. I took the candle, licked my fingers, and put it out, placed it in the bag with its... I stood up and put the duffel bag on my shoulders. I gently limped on the other leg. The pain was still there, but I definitely had a little more hope. I looked around and looked out the window, briefly, standing on a small stool that was in there. I looked out, and it was getting dark. I knew that I couldn't survive down here with all the dead that were out there. I picked up all my stuff and got my knife ready and made my way back down the horrible hallways of terror, but this time with a light unto my feet, so to speak. My exodus was not going to be an easy one, just like Moses and the Israelites. My life was not going to be perfect. It wasn't before. I was enslaved to the insurance companies and the life that had happened to me through sheer accident. It had ruined my life, but I let it lead my life, instead of having faith that better would come. I'm not trying to tell anybody that if you have faith, things will get better, because sometimes they don't, and that's what makes faith so strong, is that the hope for a better tomorrow, but not expecting a better tomorrow to come. But sometimes you gotta stop feeling sorry for yourself, and you have to get done what needs to be done. I hobbled my way down and cut the small amount of paracord and stuffed it back in my pocket for later. I briefly opened one of the doors, and it creaked. Most of them didn't notice it, as they were still around where the flashbang had gone off that I'd used. I slowly made my way out and went through the back door and hopped underneath a fence, knowing that I very well couldn't climb a fence, not with my condition, and I made my way down a lonely road where the trucks were going. Again, I saw some bodies strewn about, and both a mixture of dead and those biker gangs. I looked at some of them and rolled them over, and saw the horror of death frozen on their face, and others, with the peace of death frozen on their face, asked to tell a story of coming to terms with their life. I remembered seeing more dead strewn along, as though they were to be played with, some stuck on pikes and others were nailed to walls. Cruel and disgusting, yes, but it truly showed the condition of humanity. Ignoring it, I continued down the way and down the lanes, crossing streets and going through small parking garages to cut my way through the traffic jam and the amount of dead that were just parked in one spot, staring off into nowhere, waiting for the next noise to stimulate them. I went to the second floor of a small hotel that was in the downtown district, and I finally got up to about the third floor and stacked a couple boxes right towards the steps and to make sure that nobody would come up after me, and if they did, I would hear it. I took the cord that I cut off the door and placed it around that doorknob and tied it off and locked all the doors and made sure the latches were on tight, and I opened up the patio and went over to the balcony. I was just far enough away to where nobody would notice me, but close enough to the ground door I'd be able to bug out quite quick. I looked down and saw one of the dead looking up, like a turkey before it rains. What was he looking for? Why was he looking up? I asked myself. I sat there, and as I braced myself, I pulled a chair and put one arm underneath my chin as I held myself to stare at him. With no TV, or games for that matter, I really didn't have any way to stimulate myself later in the day, so I might as well watch him, study my enemy. He stood there, continuing to look up. He turned and made his way, and I felt like he stared right at me. I knew that his eyes had been milky white and he was blind, that he'd be unable to find me. But still, it stood there for a minute and turned its head and began to meander slowly over to one of the parked cars. I bumped into it, shuffled a little bit backwards, and continued to move a different direction. What an existence. What journey was he on that would go nowhere? I guess that was the difference between us and the dead. We continued to look up and hope for a better tomorrow, all the while being bumped around by various objects and obstacles in our life. Continued to keep our chin up and our head looking to the sky, hoping that one day things would get better. But for the dead, things had gotten better or things had gotten worse for them. But their shells missed their master. They just wandered around the streets, looking off into oblivion, doing nothing. I knew that my journey was not going to be easy, and I knew that I very well couldn't go home now. Maybe someday there was some hope in the back of my head that maybe one day I would be able to. But as of now, I couldn't. I was on my own for a little while. And maybe it was necessary. Maybe this is God's plan, or maybe this is just fate catching up with me. Maybe I needed to be alone. Maybe I needed to be on this little trip of mine. Maybe this is what is necessary for me to come back to reality. I needed to be disciplined. I slowly closed the sliding door and made my way to the nicely made bed. I went over and laid down and placed the duffel bag towards the door as to act as a buffer. I laid down, taking off all my armor and some of my clothes and getting ready for bed, and I laid down again and looked up at the ceiling. There really was hope, and there really is something better afterwards. I really hope that I can be forgiven for what I've done. All the kids like Logan and Dylan, the Silo kids, and my friends there, Tiffany, Derek, and Nathan, just to name a few. All my friends that were waiting for me to come home were most likely worried. My mom and dad, my brothers and sisters. I didn't want to know what they thought about what I did, but I knew that they loved me, and I knew that they cared about me. And I knew that they wanted me home. But I knew that I had to go on a journey first. This is my exodus.